Okay, sitting up here. Hi, so my name's Connor. I'm doing my presentation on revitalizing soil health through biodynamic practices, namely cover cropping and silvopasture. These are different types of regenerative agriculture practices, and I'll go into some of the terminology to make sure everything's clear. But essentially, we want to pit biodynamic agriculture against conventional agriculture for a couple of important reasons we'll go over. So over here, I go over some of the key details and what I was trying to do. So as I stated, terminology like biodynamic, integrated farming, silvopasture, these are all agricultural techniques that are alternatives to modern conventional agriculture. In South Florida, this is a prominent issue because soil has proven to be a limited resource, and at the rate that it deteriorates, at around 1 to 2 millimeters per year, we won't have enough arable soils to support the amount of food that we need produced. South Florida being a year-round growing region, agriculture is important, but we don't have the practices implemented in order to make this a long-term and secure resource for our future here. So looking into alternatives that regenerate and bolster the health of soil is probably more important than trying to find roundabout ways of increasing productivity. Overall, these practices build up a healthier environment and healthy soils that make it more resilient and improve soils over time rather than deteriorate. So this project was carried out. This probably goes to about a year now, or probably 9 or 10 months, on a farm in South Florida in the Redlands agricultural region. The farm's called Little Farm, and we implemented these practices to regenerate formerly conventionally used, very compacted horse pasture land to make it a usable piece of land in food production. So there's been a lot of studies on regenerative agriculture and namely biodynamic. So far there's been 147 publications on the efficacy of biodynamic agriculture, its practices, sustainability on food quality, soil fertility, human health, microbial health, biodiversity, and a ton of other important markers that distinguish it and make it an important feature to look at. So these are not widespread forms of agriculture, especially in South Florida, but they do have potential to have huge impacts on soil health, biodiversity, and sustainability. So we want to look at biodynamic farming and the uniqueness of growing the subtropical region to clearly demonstrate that this form of agriculture has a important place in the future of food in South Florida. So here's some terminology we want to look at. So to start, we have integrated farming, which is a type of agriculture which uses all major farm components on the process level. So this essentially integrates the different components of a farm in a manner that brings them all together and reduces waste streams and essentially makes a closed loop system where we're not losing any sort of production on any side from waste products going to landfills. Instead, we like to recycle waste products from one feature of a farm, namely like the animal production in this case, into another valuable production of like a vegetable growing. So this type of farming considers nutrient, energy cycling, waste reduction, and it is modeled around nutrient and energy flows on a farm where you can predict accumulation of nutrients, where to move them, where they're going to be best used to reduce soil loss and nutrient loss. So Another important term to look at is regenerative agriculture, from Gabe Brown's description. These are types of agriculture that are no-till or minimal, keeping the ground covered, use diversity in polyculture, keep living roots in the ground, the soil, and very importantly, integrate animals. When we look at sustainability from the Farm Bill definition, they satisfied human food fiber needs, enhance the environment, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources, have economic viability, and enhance the quality of life of farmers. Biodynamic farming, which is probably the definition we want to closely relate this type of agriculture to, are systems that follow sustainable, holistic approaches using organic, locally sourced materials for fertilizers, and it views the farm as a closed off but diversified ecosystem. So essentially, you use the entire ecosystem, the entire energy cycle, the waste flows in order to create productivity. So in this case, operating not separately as an animal and vegetable farm, instead, production is integrated, and both sectors benefit from it. So it has high uses of environmental efficiency, waste reduction, kind of like the integrated farming, and is an aim to look for. For this project specifically, two of the main biodynamic farming practices we used were cover cropping and silvopasture. So in the case for cover cropping, we wanted to use a polyculture of plants that were suited for our local environment, were site specific. And I'll go into more detail about the different plants we used and benefits they accrued. But essentially, we used different types of grasses, legumes, um, in order to revitalize nitrogen, phosphorus, improve soil fertility, structure, and a whole host of different benefits. But namely for soil restoration, regeneration, in order to turn a piece of land that was not fit for agriculture and to restore it into a very fruitful piece of land. Another main means of regenerative agriculture that we practice in this case was silvopasture, which is a method of agroforestry where we utilize fruit trees or edible landscapes, incorporate animals into vegetable crop production, utilizing livestock feeding, essentially creating a symbiotic relationship between the land where we're growing food and the animals that we're using as livestock, for food production or whatever other case. So not only does it promote healthy plants through the nutrient-rich manures and compost that we get from them, not only does it efficiently weed areas to reduce labor, it also gives a healthy diet to the animals, and they're able to recycle nutrients back into the system to promote healthy energy cycles, and create an overall robust and energetic environment. So these are common practices in different cultures, but in our modern day, we've seemed to have separated animal and crop production. But for regenerative agriculture, it appears that integrating both animals and crop productions in the same system is necessary. So here's some more detail on the cover crops that we utilized. Um, Going down, we have red cowpeas, Sudan grass, mustard mix, buckwheat, and sun hemp. And I attached some information on each of these, but essentially these were carefully picked to be suited for our hot, humid environment. At the time that we planted, it was right before the rainy season. Things were warming up, and we're getting wet. So we have a mix of different plants, of legumes, grasses, and other beneficials. And essentially, what the main features that they cover is they regenerate soil health, They kill soil pathogens like nematodes, thrips, other pests. They increase carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. They move around nutrients in the soil to make them more plant available for crops. They bring in pollinators. Um, and overall, they completely revitalize not only the soil you're working in, but the environment for pollinators, for birds, and also for the animals that we're raising on the property. So we integrated the cover cropping with the silvopasture, bringing in horses, cows, sheep, goats, chickens into this cover crop pasture system where they can get high quality fodder for their diet, increase their livelihood, manage the system that we're in, but also recycle back in their nutrient rich manures. So it creates this biodynamic cycle that we're looking at in order to improve soil health with as minimal input and labor as possible. So another ingredient to note is in order to get successful nitrogen fixing in our leguminous plants, we used a strain of ribozoa, Legusium uh, viceae, and a couple others in order to properly inoculate our seeds for our sun hemp and our cowpea. And you can see the nodules on the next slide. Essentially, this is what we're looking at or looking for clear indicators of nitrogen fixing in our soils. So we see the nodules, we have the pinkish hue, so we know that there's a successful colony of ribozoa in our cover crop and that we're actively fixing nitrogen in order to revitalize and make more nutrients available for our subsequent crops. So we're going to show some more pictures of the process of revitalizing this area. So essentially we wanted to kill off the sod first to promote a clear space free of weeds like nutsedge and different long grasses, which can be considered noxious weeds in some cases and extremely hard to deal with in a non-tilling scenario. We incorporated multiple tons of composted animal manure, a mix of our polyculture animal manure from our goats, sheep, chickens, cows, which are high in nitrogen, phosphorus, and also uh, the microbial community that are important for bolstering healthy soil diversity. So we incorporated those and we direct seeded all of our different cover crops into this pasture with no irrigation, just using natural rain cycles to germinate and grow a successful crop of cover crops. After that, we integrated the silvopasture animal grazing for our ducks and chickens. They can eat some of the plants that we had planted, but namely what they were looking for were the insects that the cover crops, namely the buckwheat, the mustard plants, attracted as quality protein fodder for them. So here's just a timeline of the different land restoration techniques we use. So incorporating animal-based manures and compost, amendments, the multi-species cover cropping, multi-species rotational grazing, incorporating cover crops into permanent no-till garden beds, and lastly, holistic management, free of pesticides, chemical use, or tillage to continue building healthy, resilient soils with minimal input. So just some more information on the animals. They were key in developing this practice as we don't import any off-site nutrients. Everything comes from the farm. So all the animal manures are composted in wood shaving bedding, and those are reincorporated into the soils as composts. They were used in the land restoration, in the silvopasture, the grazing. They are a key integral part of this growing operation and are the key of fertility and healthy crops. More pictures of our goat and sheep grazing. When successfully rotationally grazed, you don't keep them in for too long, so you have a successful cover crop without depleting it, and then you're able to terminate it and reintegrate all this green matter into the soil. Here are some just expenses in operating small scale agriculture that we saw, namely in Florida: cost of land lease, cost of inputs, time, cost of labor, and general knowledge. It's not an easy practice by any means, but under the right management and following these practices, it becomes very minimal input, minimal labor, because it's relying on natural nutrient cycling, animal integration, and minimal management. Just a picture of some of the expenses that can be expected in an operation like this, and why it's important to reduce costs as much as possible. The main means of doing that is through the integration of animals through compost, basically covering all the nutrient expenses of plants. We're using less fertilizer applications, less compost, which makes the operation way cheaper than the alternative of trying to grow organic using costly inputs, potting mixes, fertilizers, nutrients, etc. Animal manure compost can cover the broad spectrum of micronutrients needed, and as long as you have holistic management, you can continue building healthy soils that seem to improve each subsequent season. So we wanted to reference some studies looking at biodynamic farming. This one in the quality of potatoes, utilizing certain biomarkers to distinguish biodynamic crops from conventional, looking at several biomarkers, EAA indices, quality, dry matter content, interestingly, taste, and relative proportion of proteins, biocrystallization scores, yield. Essentially, these are all biomarkers in the quality and health of the plant. And in conventional versus biodynamic, we see a bunch of different differences, but overall, this study seems to point that biodynamic farming can produce maybe not a crop that correlates as much in pure yield, but overall quality of the crops, health, nutrient density. These crops seem to outperform the conventional crops, while at the same time, in this biodynamic setting, can do it cheaper and also bring all the ecosystem services that operating this kind of system provides. Next, we're looking at just a couple studies that look at the biodynamic versus conventional versus organic. And we see this correlation more of on 3 different factors of impact, sustainability, and food quality. We see biodynamic is head to toe with organic and outperforms conventional. Let's see. And here's some pictures of the process of terminating cover crop and creating our no-till raised garden beds, essentially pulling out the pathways, reutilizing that nutrient-rich soil, and using all the green matter from our cover crops as the base of the beds, incorporating high carbon, high nutrient dense material, fodder for microorganisms to eat. And later on the slide, we'll see some of the results. Just more pictures of preparation, where we're able to integrate heavy machinery, but in a holistic management practice where we're not compacting soil. Some pictures of finished products. We utilized drip irrigation. We were having, from the get-go, high yields on plants, no signs of nutrient deficiencies. So some interesting information that we pulled from this this was from a farm intern, Rosanna, and she did a study on the pH, soil moisture, and NPK of the soil. testing a few of our garden beds, we actually saw deficiency in some of the macronutrients typically tested. So we read deficient nitrogen, adequate phosphorus, deficient potassium. Our pH was actually around 7.5, which was close to neutral, pretty good growing conditions for our plants compared to what Florida soils can typically run at. Soil moisture averaged around 7, reading normal. Utilizing drip irrigation, especially during the hot times of year. Soil moisture is an important factor to look at for plant health. But when we're looking at the macronutrients, we saw deficiencies in nitrogen and potassium, but when we went to actual crops produced, we saw high vigor, high taste, and overall good visual appearance. No obvious signs of micro or macronutrient deficiencies. And what I think happened is, since these are very newly established beds, in constructing them, we use the cover crops, essentially a fill soil, which was probably low in nutrients, that essentially we wanted to charge with the compost. We reincorporated that with the top dressing of the native soil that we built up. So we have varying levels of nutrient availability in the soil profiles that we have that over time will kind of fill the gap and become more homogenized. But I think with the nature of the testing, you get a lot of that fill dirt in the actual test, and it doesn't really account for all the available nutrients that might be on the top couple layers of the soil where we have high amounts of compost, and lower down where we have that natural built soil and the cover crops. So it's something that we have to monitor over time and see if it changes as the soils begin to homogenize, get turned over by worms and other soil microorganisms. And here are just some of the results that we saw. Besides the test that we did, we seem to have plants that had soils that had high nutritive levels, as we saw no nutrient deficiencies, at least for micronutrients. Beds had high water retention and good drainage. We had very good sandy, loamy soil with tons of organic matter, which we'll have to do some tests on. Little to no requirements for off-farm inputs, as we just use the animal-based compost, composted chicken bedding, and that seems to do the trick for the plants. And we had little disease and pest pressure. With all this polyculture of plants, we had lots of native pollinators, we had honeybees, native pollinators too, different moths, butterflies, etc. Ladybugs, and very importantly, we had flavorful, healthy looking crops that we were able to bring to farmers markets, and just visually and taste wise, we got really great feedback on those. So in summary, these land restoration practices were researched, planned, and performed to ameliorate formerly conventionally used soils in order to regenerate them, constructed garden beds, operated a farm on minimal input, and we continue to implement several agroecological processes, monitor soil health, plant health in order to see what the future of regenerative agriculture in South Florida can appear to be. So more pictures of the crops we produced. So as I stated before, although the nutritive tests for macronutrients seem to show low nutrients in nitrogen and potassium or phosphorus, we had the visual field data from the actual crops that we pulled that seemed to show that perhaps more tests on our soil qualities or properties are needed in order to get a more accurate depiction of the actual health of the soil. So we'll look at more readings like soil EC, CEC, soil microorganisms, organic matter content, and continue to monitor this. We're excited. Thank you so much. That was my presentation.